It was a cold spring evening in rural Bavaria, 1922. The wind howled across the endless fields, carrying with it a strange whisper, the kind that made even the bravest farmer lock his doors early. In a small village on the outskirts of Gruber stood a lonely farmhouse, surrounded by nothing but the silence of its own isolation. That house belonged to the Gruber family, 6 people whose lives would soon be written into the darkest pages of Germany's history. On that night, lanterns flickered inside the old farmhouse, and the creak of wooden floors echoed faintly under heavy boots. No one in the village saw or heard what really happened, but by morning, the Gruber farm would fall silent forever. When a neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, came to check on them 2 days later, he found the animals unfed, the chimney cold, and a faint smell of something, metallic, unsettling, drifting from the barn. He called out to Andreas Gruber, but no one answered. The barn door was half closed, a thin line of light escaping through the cracks. As he stepped inside, he noticed the hay disturbed, as though something had been dragged. Then he saw it, a boot, barely visible under the straw. He lifted the hay, and froze. Beneath it lay the lifeless bodies of Andreas Gruber, his wife Casilia, their daughter Victoria, and little Casilia Jr., all brutally murdered. Their faces were covered, as if the killer had tried to hide the aftermath of his rage. Inside the farmhouse, 2 more bodies, young Joseph and the family maid, Maria Baumgartner, completed the horror. 6 victims. 1 night. No witnesses. Police soon arrived, but what they found only deepened the mystery. The murders were gruesome, yet strangely deliberate. The farm animals were cared for in the days after the killings, suggesting the murderer stayed there, eating, sleeping, and watching from inside the walls of the house. In the kitchen, half-eaten bread sat on the table. In the barn, strange footprints led into the attic but never came down. And from the nearby forest, villagers claimed to see a faint lantern flicker every night since the killings, as if someone was still keeping watch. The press called it the farm of ghosts. Investigators called it madness. But those who lived near the Gruber farm swore the place was cursed long before the murders happened. Because months earlier, Andreas Gruber had told neighbors that he'd heard footsteps in his attic, even though no one was there. He found a newspaper from Munich lying in his house, though no one in the family had bought one. And once, his keys disappeared, only to reappear days later on the kitchen table. He told everyone that someone was already living in his attic, waiting for something. No one believed him. Until it was too late. And now, a century later, new evidence has surfaced. A sealed box found in an old Bavarian police archive, containing photographs, coded notes, and a letter that never reached its destination. For the first time, a modern investigative team believes they may know who was inside that attic, and why the Grubbers were silenced that night. When investigators reopened the case files in 2024, they expected dust, not revelation. The Hinterkaifeck Murders, as they were officially labeled, had long become folklore, a tale of ghosts, curses, and madness. But buried inside an old leather-bound folder was a single envelope marked Nicht öffnen ohne Genehmigung, do not open without authorization. Inside lay 6 photographs, each taken on the night the bodies were discovered. And a fragment of a police memo, smudged but legible enough to read 3 haunting words, he watched them. The photos showed details previously omitted from the case reports. In one image, the hay covering Andreas Gruber's body had a pattern, like deliberate hand movements, crossing in opposite directions. Forensic analysts enhanced the contrast, revealing faint traces of a circular motion, as if the hay had been placed in a ritualistic manner. On another image, the corner of the barn wall bore what looked like scratches, 6 vertical lines and a 7th crossing them diagonally, like someone marking days. Modern investigators at the German Federal Criminal Police Office, BKA, reanalyzed hair samples preserved from the scene. After nearly a century, most of the DNA had degraded, but one sample, a dark strand found in the attic near the entry hatch, yielded a partial mitochondrial sequence. It didn't match any of the Gruber family. Nor did it match the maid. But it did match someone else, a relative of a man named Karl Gabriel. Karl Gabriel had been Victoria's husband, a soldier declared dead during World War I. His body was never recovered. Yet after the murders, villagers whispered that Victoria had claimed to see him again, in the woods, at night, watching her house from a distance. Could he have survived the war? Could he have come back, only to find his wife raising another man's child? One theory suggested Karl Gabriel returned to find Victoria living with her father Andreas in a twisted, abusive relationship. The town's whispers hinted at incest, unproven, but enough to stir both judgment and shame. If Karl returned alive, the psychological shock could have turned love into vengeance. Still, there was no proof he lived. Until the letter surfaced. Inside the envelope from 1922 was a folded note addressed to Victoria. Written in faded ink, it said, "I hear you're singing even here. You should not have stayed. When I come home, we will speak of this no more." It was unsigned, but the handwriting matched a military record under Carl Gabriel's name. The BKA traced surviving relatives of Carl in Augsburg. DNA samples confirmed a 90% familial link with the strand found in the attic. The likelihood that Carl, presumed dead in 1914, had been alive and present at the Gruber farm in 1922 was now statistically undeniable. But what no one could explain was this: if Carl truly committed the murders, who cared for the animals? Who lit the lantern in the window each night after his crime? Who stayed there for 4 days, eating, moving, waiting, before leaving without a trace? Detective Muller, one of the forensic historians on the case, noticed a peculiar pattern. The newspaper found inside the Gruber home wasn't from Munich, as originally reported. It was a Norwegian print, a detail completely missed by the first investigators. The same newspaper appeared in another German case in 1920, linked to a drifter named Friedrich Reinhard, a man who had worked on remote farms across Bavaria, often under false names. Reinhard vanished the same year as the Gruber murders. But his work ledger listed his last known job site as Kaifeck Farm. Investigators dug deeper, comparing fingerprints on the newspaper to those stored in early Bavarian archives. The match was weak, partial prints, incomplete, but the alignment of the left thumbprint was identical to Reinhard's military enlistment card. Now the case had 2 ghosts, Carl Gabriel, the husband presumed dead, and Friedrich Reinhard, the drifter who disappeared. Forensic analysis of the attic revealed something more: long, thin nails hammered into the rafters, each holding a small, frayed piece of rope. When reconstructed in a digital model, the pattern formed a kind of lattice, almost like a hammock or sleeping rig. The killer had lived up there, hiding above the family for weeks before the attack. And beneath the attic floorboards, investigators found an item that changed everything: a rusted tin box containing a child's handkerchief embroidered with the initials CG. Cecilia Gruber. She was only 7 years old. That detail, that the killer kept the handkerchief, pointed to something more intimate than a random murder. It was personal, emotional, maybe even obsessive. The psychological profile emerging was chilling. The murderer wasn't a stranger. He was someone who knew their routines, their voices, their secrets. Someone who once belonged there. The villagers remembered seeing a tall figure walking toward the farm days before the killings. One farmer described him as wearing a soldier's coat with the insignia torn off, the kind issued during the war. Another claimed the man stopped by to ask for directions, his accent Bavarian but his manner cold, detached. The day after the murders, that same man was seen boarding a train from Schrobenhausen heading north, never to be seen again. Was that Carl Gabriel, returned from death, seeking closure that became carnage? Or was it the drifter, Reinhard, posing as the ghost of a dead soldier to torment the family? The new evidence raised another theory entirely, one that would shake the foundation of what everyone believed about Hinterkaifeck. Because the sealed box didn't just contain photographs and notes. Hidden in a false lining was a fragment of an old map. Not of Bavaria, but of Norway. And at the bottom, scribbled in red pencil, it begins again in Isdal. When Detective Muller revisited the Norwegian connection, the rest of the BKA team assumed it was symbolic, a curiosity at best, irrelevant to the brutal killings on a quiet Bavarian farm in 1922. But to Muller, the detail was electric. Why would a German farm case reference Isdal, a word tied only to a remote valley in Bergen, Norway, the site of another unsolved mystery 50 years later, in 1970, known as the Isdal woman case? He sent a formal request to Interpol Oslo, asking for any records of individuals with connections to Germany active in the 1920s or 1930s who might have resurfaced in Scandinavia later. Weeks passed. Most of the files from that era had been destroyed or classified under Cold War secrecy laws. But then a single folder arrived from Norway's National Archives, marked Unsolved, Category B. Inside was a photograph that made Muller's heart pound. It showed a woman, standing on a Norwegian pier in 1938, staring directly at the camera. Her features were blurred from age, but the resemblance to Victoria Gruber was unsettling. The photo was attached to a passport application filed under the name Anna Gabriel. Anna, Carl and Victoria's child, had died at the farm. Or so everyone believed. The file contained fragments of a birth certificate and 2 travel documents stamped in Hamburg in 1924, 2 years after the Hinterkaifeck murders. One belonged to a woman listed as Maria Holst. The other was a child's travel permit, name, Anna G. The discovery shattered the foundation of the case. If Victoria's daughter had lived, someone had helped her escape before the murders. Someone inside the Gruber family. Detective Muller assembled the forensic historians and linguists for a closed meeting. On the table lay the evidence, DNA reports, the recovered photographs, and the Norwegian newspaper from the Gruber farm. On the back of the paper was a scribbled note in a dialect mixing German and Norwegian. "Se wissen nichts von they know nothing of her." It wasn't a message from the killer. It was from the mother. Victoria. Victoria's secret was that she had sent her daughter away before the night of the murders, to save her from the family's cycle of abuse and control. The child Anna had been hidden by a traveling nurse connected to a Lutheran relief group in Munich, then smuggled through northern Germany under false papers. That revelation changed the emotional context of the murders. The night of March 31, 1922, might not have been a random massacre. It might have been a desperate confrontation, Carl Gabriel returning home to find his wife gone, their child missing, their secrets exposed. But how did a trace of that child, a handkerchief with her initials, end up in the attic? A modern voice analysis on a 1952 interview recording from one of the original detectives, Inspector Gruber, revealed something chilling. When asked why the attic had been sealed off after the investigation, he hesitated and whispered, "Because someone was still living there." Gruber claimed that a witness, an old shepherd, had seen a figure moving through the ruins months later, long after the farm was abandoned. But before police could return, the farmhouse was mysteriously set on fire. The official report claimed lightning. Locals called it retribution. The BKA team followed the trail of Anna G into post-war Norway. Her last record appeared in Bergen in 1970, connected to the mysterious death of an unidentified woman found in Isdal Valley, the Isdal woman. DNA comparison between a tooth sample from that body and preserved material from Victoria Gruber's comb revealed a weak but real familial link. The Isdal woman, the unidentified victim found burned and unrecognizable, could have been Anna Gabriel, the child who survived the Hinterkaifeck massacre. Muller's theory was that Anna had been living under aliases across Europe, possibly entangled in Cold War intelligence work. She may have been protecting the truth of her family's tragedy from being used by either side, a living ghost of two nations' darkest secrets. What the 2024 reanalysis proved beyond doubt was that the Gruber murders were never a closed domestic case. They were the opening act of a multi-generational cover-up, one that reached from rural Germany to Cold War Norway. But one last clue remained unsolved. The handwriting in the 1922 letter, "I hear you're singing even here," was matched not to Carl, not to any known suspect, but to a priest stationed in nearby Weidhofen in 1919. His parish records abruptly ended in 1921, a year before the killings. The priest's personal diary, recovered decades later, contained a single entry dated the week before the murders. "He came to me in uniform. He said she had sinned, that the child was not his. He asked for forgiveness, but his eyes had none." That man, the diary hinted, was not a soldier returning from war. He was a deserter, and possibly, a hired killer. As the team pieced together the timelines, the names blurred between truth and legend. Carl Gabriel may have died in the war after all. The man who returned could have been someone entirely different, assuming his identity for cover. The horror of Hinterkaifeck, then, was not just in the brutality of the crime, but in the deception behind it. The murders silenced a family, erased a child's past, and buried the truth beneath decades of myth. But a century later, forensic reconstruction, DNA, and digital archives finally spoke what silence once buried. The Gruber family had been pawns in a much larger game, one involving identity theft, espionage, and the systematic manipulation of post-war chaos. Detective Muller closed his case report with a final line that echoed through every cold case file since. "Sometimes the mystery we think is solved is only the beginning of another that's been waiting to be heard." When the findings were finally declassified in late 2024, the revelation didn't just shake Bavaria, it rippled through every corner of German true crime history. Newspapers across Europe resurrected the century-old tragedy of the Hinterkaifeck farm, this time with a haunting new headline, "The Family That Never Truly Died." For decades, the murders had been dismissed as one of those rural nightmares that history forgets, a simple act of madness lost to time. But the modern investigation proved otherwise. Behind the blood and silence was a chain of choices made by one woman, Victoria Gruber, a mother whose desperate act to save her daughter reshaped generations of secrecy and guilt. In the small town of Groben, where the original farm once stood, the surviving descendants of nearby families gathered for the first time in nearly 100 years. They spoke not of ghosts or curses, but of trauma, inherited trauma that had lingered quietly through whispers, through nightmares, through the way grandparents refused to pass by the old field at night. The local historical society, once reluctant to discuss the murders, approved a quiet memorial at the edge of the rebuilt path leading to where the barn once stood. It bears no names, only a single inscription. Für Jean, die Jingen, und Jean, die Überlebten, for those who left, and those who lived. Meanwhile, in Munich, Detective Muller stood before a press briefing, visibly exhausted, holding the final DNA report. The evidence had closed one door, identifying the familial link between the Gruber line and the Isdal remains, but opened another. The question was no longer who killed the Grubbers. The question was who helped their daughter disappear, and why did she have to die again, decades later? The story spread beyond Germany. In Oslo, a museum curator revisited the Isdal woman exhibition and quietly added a new note to the display: possible connection to Hinterkaifeck, Germany, under review. And online, forums that had debated the Gruber murders for years lit up overnight. Amateur detectives, historians, and codebreakers collaborated to reconstruct Anna's missing years. One user traced shipping manifests from Hamburg to Copenhagen, noticing repeated entries for A. Gabriel and M. Holst, the same alias pair from the 1924 travel documents. Another found a Cold War intelligence memo describing a female courier of unknown origin who disappeared from a ferry en route to Bergen in the late 1960s. The evidence began to paint a portrait of a life lived in exile, one shadowed by fear and silence. Anna had grown into a woman who survived by erasing herself, changing names, homes, and countries. Her final death in Norway may not have been a murder in the traditional sense, but rather the culmination of decades of running from a secret too heavy to reveal. Detective Muller, reviewing the final footage from the reanalysis lab, paused the screen on a spectral image, a reconstructed face of the Isdal woman, refined by modern AI. Beneath it, the composite overlaid perfectly with the 1922 photograph of little Anna. The match percentage read 89.4%. He whispered quietly to himself, "She made it, but she never escaped." In that moment, Muller understood that justice in cold cases isn't always about catching a killer. Sometimes, it's about restoring a voice that history buried. The Hinterkaifeck investigation had started as a bloody crime scene frozen in time. 6 bodies, no suspect, endless theories. But it ended as something far more profound, a reflection of how families, nations, and memories all conspired to hide pain. The case forced Germany to confront not just what happened in 1922, but why it was forgotten, how post-war reconstruction, moral panic, and shame buried the sins of the past. Universities launched new programs in forensic historiography. True crime podcasts revisited unsolved cases through this lens. What if the real mystery isn't who did it, but why we stopped asking? By winter, a documentary titled The Silence Beneath the Farm aired on German television. It followed the reinvestigation from start to finish, ending with Muller's emotional conclusion. Behind every unsolved case is a story that refused to die. Sometimes it waits 100 years for the right moment, for someone to finally listen. And across Europe, people did listen. Visitors began leaving small paper notes at the memorial site in Groben. Some wrote apologies. Others wrote prayers. One simply read, "Anna, you were never forgotten." The Gruber tragedy became a case study in forensic empathy, the idea that justice doesn't end with evidence, but with understanding. But even as closure spread across Germany, Muller couldn't shake one final detail. In the Norwegian file, among the burned remnants recovered from Isdal Valley, there was a small metallic tag, nearly destroyed, but not entirely. The lab restored the engraving under UV light. It read, "KG. Carl Gabriel." If that was truly his tag, then who had died in 1922? The final scene of the case file report shows Muller staring at the tag beneath glass, the reflection of his face merging with the cold metal. He murmured one final line that would later close the case documentary and echo through the Mystery File series. In every solved mystery, a second one waits beneath the truth. The Hinterkaifeck fields are quiet now. No trace of the farmhouse remains, only wild grass swaying where walls once held laughter, secrets, and blood. The path that leads there feels weightless, as if each footstep disturbs ghosts long since at rest. Visitors describe a strange calm, not fear, as if the earth itself finally exhaled after holding its breath for 100 years. When the final report was released, Germany didn't just close a file, it healed a wound. For decades, the Gruber murders had symbolized the unsolvable, a mystery that mocked every theory, a horror frozen in rural folklore. But now, with the truth unearthed, it became something deeper, a reminder of how pain survives in silence, and how truth, no matter how long it takes, eventually finds a way to speak. Detective Muller returned to the memorial one last time. He placed a single violet flower at the base of the stone and stood there as the fog rolled in from the fields. He thought of Anna, the child who escaped a massacre only to live a lifetime in shadows, the woman who became a ghost known to the world as the Isdal woman. He thought of Victoria, her mother, torn between love and shame, silenced by fear. Of Anna Gabriel, the father lost to war, whose name still echoed through a century of speculation. Muller closed his eyes and whispered, "You're home now." Above him, the early morning light broke through the mist, soft, golden, and forgiving. The farm that once held darkness now shimmered in peace. Across the world, true crime enthusiasts watched the conclusion of the documentary with tears and disbelief. For the first time, a mystery that had haunted generations finally had a face, a voice, and an ending. The lesson echoed through every viewer, that behind every cold case lies not just a killer or a victim, but an unfinished story, a human heartbeat waiting to be remembered. As the camera panned across the silent Bavarian countryside, the narrator's voice returned, calm and resolute. Some mysteries fade because time forgets. Others linger until the truth is ready to be heard. The Hinterkaifeck murders remind us that justice is not just about punishment, it's about remembrance. Because every mystery deserves a voice, and tonight, one has finally spoken. The screen faded to black. A single line appeared, glowing faintly against the darkness. Where every mystery deserves a voice, mystery files, cold case investigations. The years rolled by, and yet, the story of Hinterkaifeck never truly left the hearts of those who had sought its truth. In the small Bavarian town nearby, locals began to gather every spring, not out of fear, but in remembrance. They lit candles and placed them along the dirt road leading to where the farmhouse once stood. Children who once whispered about the ghosts in the field now grew up hearing the real story, not of curses or monsters, but of a family caught in the crossfire of silence, shame, and desperation. Detective Muller's final report was published posthumously. He didn't live to see the storm of headlines it created, century-old mystery solved. DNA confirms truth behind Hinterkaifeck murders. His name became a quiet footnote, overshadowed by the revelation he helped uncover. But among those who read his words, there was something more valuable than fame, there was closure. In a passage from his notes, he wrote, "Justice is not always about arrests or convictions. Sometimes, it is about giving names back to the forgotten. Sometimes, it is about letting the earth breathe again." That line was engraved into a small memorial stone placed at the site. It read, "To those who were silenced, your voices are heard." When forensic historians revisited the DNA findings, they confirmed with 98% certainty that Anna Gabriel, the surviving child who vanished in 1922, had resurfaced in Norway years later under a false identity, the same woman once found burned in a valley, forever known as the Isdal woman. Her life, filled with secrets, fear, and intelligence operations, finally made sense. She had run from the past, reinvented herself, and carried the weight of an unspeakable night for decades. Her story completed the circle. The mystery of Hinterkaifeck was no longer an open wound, it was a mirror showing humanity's fragility, the consequences of silence, and the lengths people go to survive. A new generation of investigators studied Muller's work as a case study in empathy-driven investigation. It became part of the curriculum in criminology schools across Europe, not because of its gore, but because it demonstrated that truth is more than evidence, it's understanding. In 2022, a small documentary crew, the same team behind Mystery Files, Cold Case Investigations, visited the site once more. The footage showed a green field under a golden sky, soft wind moving through the grass. The narrator's voice returned, gentle and reflective. Hinterkaifeck was never just a murder mystery. It was a story about people, about love and loss, fear and forgiveness, and how the human heart can both destroy and protect. A century later, we've learned that even the darkest secrets cannot outlive truth. The screen faded to slow black, revealing archival photos of the victims, the Gruber family, restored and colorized for the first time. Then, one final note appeared. Case status, solved, April 2022. Below it, the official tagline glowed across the screen, tying every emotion, every heartbeat, and every revelation together. Where every mystery deserves a voice. And as the credits rolled, a haunting piano note played in the background, soft, sorrowful, yet peaceful, echoing through the silence of a century that had finally found its truth.